Hi, I'm Eric, and you're watching The Fringe here on the sideboard. If you like today's decks, you can find the links in the description box down below. Also, hit that like and subscribe button to help support the channel. This week, I would like to start out with a couple honorable mentions. The first of those being any type of Winding Constrictor deck or any variant of Winding Constrictor decks. The one I have up here in front of you is a Winding Constrictor variant that's in Sultai. We're quite used to the Sultai energy decks. However, this one has dropped the hostage takers for Bristling Hydra. So, just honorable mentions to different versions of Winding Constrictor. Personally, I ran a Jund version of Winding Constrictor this week, and actually thought that the deck was really good. However, it does need a couple updates, and I I have done those. So if you want that list, just let me know, and I'll send you a copy of the updated version of the deck. Second honorable mention I would like to throw in here is Oketra's Monument and Godpharaoh's Gift decks. Those decks are definitely still floating around in the meta, so if you are going to be running a league this weekend, be on the lookout for those. So let's get started with one of the first decks that I find is going to be on your opponent list this weekend. If you're running leagues, expect to run into the new version of Blue Black. Now, that doesn't mean that Blue Black Control is gone. It should definitely still be on your radar along with Teamer Energy, Red Deck Wins, and any of the vehicles decks. However, there is a new style to Blue Black, and that is mid-range. This deck got covered by Seth Manfield himself on TCG Player this week, so it is getting a lot of play as it did get some high-end coverage. Anytime a deck gets that type of coverage, it does get a lot of play, so expect the mid-range version of the deck this weekend. Now, one of the things that I want to point out about the deck is it's going to steal a lot of its victories off of pretending to be the blue-black control deck when it doesn't actually hold the counters in its hand to stop you. I'm not trying to get you to just play straight into a counter, but do be wary that if you do see cards like Chart a Course being played, Kitesail Freebooter, or Game 1 Gifted Aetherborn, you're more than likely playing it against the mid-range version of the deck, and the deck has a lot less counter spells than it does kill spells. So be mindful of that. Don't let your opponents bluff you out of your entire turn because you were worried that they were blue-black control. Looking at the sideboard, they do have the ability in game 2 and 3 to turn into virtually the blue-black control decks that we're used to. With 4 copies of Negate, 4 copies of Duress, the rest of the playset for Essence Extraction, an additional search for Escanta to go into those long games, and then an additional copy of Gonti, Lord of Luxury. For board stalls and things of that nature. Speaking of board stalls, they have a really good way to end those here in River's Rebuke. Now, this is mainly just their answer to tokens, but it could come in against any type of matchup depending on your strategy and what you push them into. I would be prepared for a River's Rebuke out of the sideboard this weekend. So that is the new mid-range version of Blue Black or Demir. I would expect to see that along with the blue-black control decks this weekend. Don't expect blue-black control to be put out. However, those people that are looking for more of a tempo feel to their blue-black, I definitely think that this is a version of the deck that would get some play, along with Pirates decks that are definitely not gone altogether yet. So let's take a look at another deck that I think will be getting some play this week, and it's mainly because of some new interactions that have come from Ixalan. Regal Caracol is a card that has been showing up a lot over the past couple sets since it's been released in Amonkhet. We thought that the green-white deck would get a lot of power from from Hour of Devastation with the Pride Sovereigns. However, it wasn't until here recently with the arrival of Vanquisher's Banner and Shaper's Sanctuary paired with Lifecrafter's Bestiary, which gave the deck a lot of draw power along with the Anthem effect, and really turn this deck into what is reminiscent of the pre-Ixalan or pre-rotation zombies decks, with the 5 mana anthems allowing them to get extra bodies at 5 mana, and the anthem effect giving a very good keyword ability in lifelink. It really reminds me a lot of how the pre-Ixalan zombies deck played, and it seems to be a very powerful deck and has a lot of draw power, so it can continue to go into the late game with some of the strongest decks. Looking at the sideboard, this is what I would call a typical white answers sideboard. Sunscourge Champion for life gain, Ixalan's Binding for her answers to the gods, Gideon's Intervention for pretty much anything else that couldn't be answered the other way. Some heroic intervention to protect themselves against, non-targeted removal or combat tricks, and then 2 more copies of Shaper's Sanctuary to just really punish those of us using targeted removal, which, let's face it, we're all using targeted removal. Unless you're playing Fumigate and, well, Settle technically targets the opponent. How does this read? Does this protect? No, it's whenever a creature you control. So Settle the Wreckage would not trigger this. So only those decks running Settle and Board Sweepers would get around the Shaper Sanctuary. So Shaper Sanctuary really proven itself in this deck. Now, the rest of the sideboard here is filled up with the 2 copies of Crook of Condemnation, which is just a good answer for these decks against Scarab Gods and to help slowly pick out the graveyard, as they do have some embalm and eternalized creatures. They don't always want to just dump the graveyard, and if they can handle it by picking one at a time out of it, I'm sure that is why Crook of Condemnation was the better answer here over, say, the desert that could be sacked. So that is green white cats. Now, I don't necessarily think that you're going to see a lot of this deck in particular. However, you might, as it is an extremely powerful version of green white cats. I do, however, think that there will be some Regal Caracols main board. I would expect to have an answer for Regal Caracol this week. Regal Caracol has proven itself to be an extremely powerful card, so make sure that you are on the lookout for that. The life gain alone can offset some strategies to the point where you may not be able to come back from it. So make sure, if you are playing a deck that doesn't want to see the opponent all of a sudden go wide with some life linkers, that you are at least trying to play around the Regal Caracols. So let's take a look at a version of tokens that a lot of you might have wanted to take a look at. We're used to Abzan tokens, and I 100% expect that Abzan tokens will get some play this weekend, as it is like a tier 1.5 deck. I would put this particular deck somewhere near that, maybe tier 2, as the deck slows down quite a bit, and it doesn't have the early revolt triggers in Renegade Map, as this went with Treasure Map. However, this deck did top 16 in Cincinnati, so it is slightly proven. However, it's not a top 8 deck, so we'll put this at tier 1.5. Taking a look at the deck, different from the Abzan list that only runs 1 green source in the entire deck, this does have some Glacial Fortress and some Drowned Catacombs to help round out the blue, as the deck does play more blue sources, or more blue spells, those in Champion of Wits and Scarab God. For better or worse, this is your Orzhov tokens deck that makes up the backbone of Abzan tokens, Mardu tokens. There's a few different variants, but it makes up the backbone of those decks. And then the WinCon has just been swapped out from Vraska to Champion of Wits and the Scarab God. Now, if you're playing this deck or playing against this deck, The game is pretty much over the point someone untaps with an Anointed Procession and a Scarab God on the battlefield. If you thought that you were entering scoop phase for letting someone untap with the Scarab God, just wait until they have an Anointed Procession on the battlefield. So make sure that you are mindful of this line of play, as this turn 4 into this turn 5 unanswered on turn 6 will more than likely just end the game for most decks. So let's go ahead and take a look at their sideboard. Here you'll see the base white sideboard that I spoke of earlier. Now, because this deck has black, you probably won't see the Gideon's Intervention in these, and they'll just choose to go with Lost Legacy. However, honestly, I kind of like Gideon's Intervention, as it can deal with something after you get it. A Scarab God that enters the battlefield can still have Gideon's Intervention cast on it, or better yet, Hazard. You could still cast this onto a Hazard so that the Hazard couldn't deal damage to you. You'll see Sunscourge Champion here in the sideboard. Some Demystifies. I personally think that you're going to want some way to destroy an artifact, not just an enchantment, but here he went with Demystify, and then some negates and duress to round everything out. So this is a new take on tokens. I'm not really thinking that this will be a prevalent take, but is just one to be aware of. And if you do run into a tokens build that pulls out an island on you, then at that point you should be aware that you're probably going to get scarab guided at some point in this game if they can pull it. So let's take a look at our final Fringe deck today. Now, this is a deck that I wanted to talk to everyone about because this deck's getting an extreme amount of hype on Reddit and online. I've seen this deck get a lot of play, and I've seen a lot of variants of this deck. So I don't want to go over the overall backbone or the overall utility portion of the deck. However, I do just want to kind of go over the backbone of the deck, what the deck uses to get the job done. And that is, for better or worse, these cards: Saheeli Ra, Panharmonicon, Trespasser's Curse, Rampaging Ferocidon, and Dousing Dagger. So it uses these cards along with some type of utility package to help get to these cards to just outright burn you by having Dousing Dagger enter the battlefield and give you 2 creatures. You get 2 creatures, you trigger this multiple times, it gets out of hand from there. Panharmonicon creates it to where you get 4 creatures, and each one of those would trigger Trespasser's Curse twice. That's 8 points of damage. If you have Panharmonicon, 2 Trespassers, it's 16. Panharmonicon, Trespassers, and a Rampaging, it's 16. Heaven forbid Panharmonicon in any 3 of these 8 cards, and you're going to end up with what is that? Oh my god, 24 damage. It's ridiculous. Saheeli Ra just giving you the ability to copy most of the parts of your combo. However, it can't copy the Trespasser's Curse, but it can copy the Dousing Dagger for additional enter the battlefield effects. Now, do I expect this version of the deck to be played? Yes, I do. This particular version has about a 60 to 65% matchup in game 1 versus Teamer Energy and versus most other strategies except for the blue-black control variants. Now, the blue-black mid-range only has 3 counter spells main board that can stop this deck from going off. So even the blue-black mid-range doesn't have a very good matchup versus this deck. And when it comes to blue-black in general, them getting back a copy of our Rampaging Ferocidon does nothing for hurting our side of how this combo works. It doesn't really matter if they have it or we have it. They're going to take some points of damage for the creatures entering the battlefield. It will affect how Panharmonicon affects the triggers, so you will lose some Panharmonicon effects if they have control of the Rampaging Ferocidon. But this deck actually is really good against Scarab God variants, very good against Teamer Energy, and that's why I picked it for the #1 deck to see as a Fringe deck this week. Now, only time will tell whether this deck gets continuous play on into next week or if someone builds a different version of the deck. If you'll notice, the backbone of the deck is actually only black or red and doesn't really need any other color to work. I expect that Saheeli Rai is part of that backbone, so maybe black, red, blue is the only way to go with it. But you may see some versions of this deck show up somewhere else. However, if you do see a Trespasser's Curse this weekend, look out, or especially a Panharmonicon and a Trespasser's Curse, look out for a Dowsing Dagger. It's probably there somewhere. Um, Expecting a sideboard strategy out of these decks, I would expect some type of counterplay to allow them to slip in their combo pieces. Spell Pierce being high on that list, Negate being high on that list, Duress to help pick away at your hand. However, I actually think Kitesail Freebooter is a better card in this deck for those strategies, as you do have Panharmonicon and could technically get away two spells out of their hand. Fatal Push I wasn't really fond of in this deck. Bantu's Last Reckoning seemed absolutely phenomenal in the deck, as the deck doesn't really need to keep down creatures on its side until it's actually ready to just multiply those creatures on into the game. Lost Legacy, for just anything it just couldn't answer with. Vraska's Contempt, because it's one of the best answers for the gods. And then a few copies of a Braid. For better or worse, this deck is currently built in the way that I would go into a league this weekend. It has answers to most of the things that need to be answered. However, I don't know if the main strategy of this deck is competitive enough to take into a league. I do know that there is enough hype to the main strategy of the deck that you should be expecting to run into some copies of it at some point this week. So, that concludes our show for the Fringe this week. Thank you for watching. I've had a lot of fun. I hope you've had a lot of fun. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time here on the sideboard.